Okay, welcome back to another episode of Shadows and Ink. And today's guest is talented author Marc Abbot. And we're going to be talking zombies today. So I'm going to let him introduce himself. So take it away.
Hi, I'm Marc Abbott. I am a New York City-based horror writer. I dabble a little bit in everything from monsters to zombies. I've covered cosmic horror as well. And I do a little bit of storytelling, and I'm also a creative writing teacher.
Yeah, you do it all. Um, so, um, so how long have you been writing about zombies, and which of your books feature zombies?
Oh, okay. So I dabbled a little bit with zombies, with the undead. I've done zombies and mummies are pretty much kind of the two that have been kind of bedfellows for me. Blackened Roots, which is an anthology of horror stories about the undead, is where I've written my most recent zombie piece within the hull, which has to deal with a zombie ship during the slave trade and how the slaves who threw themselves overboard to die rather than to be sold kind of got onto like a type of Flying Dutchman kind of deal where they are resurrected as zombies to serve the ship. And then they go out and they attack the slave ships that are carrying others. So that's my most recent piece of work with zombies.
That's an interesting premise. It's
Mhm.
not your usual sort of zombie.
Mhm. No, no, that when they asked me to be a part of the book, they really wanted something that was unconventional. They didn't really want the zombies that we've known and grown up with, the ones that run fast and eat humans and things of that nature. They wanted something different. So it was interesting to delve into that side of the zombie world because I remembered I believe it was the last Pirates of the Caribbean movie where the Flying Dutchman had these sailors on there. I think it was Arthur Teach, one of the pirates, Blackbeard. His ship was full of zombies, and I didn't realize that they were zombies. I thought they were just other crewmen, but when I did a little more research, I was like, oh, that's interesting to make them kind of slaves to the actual ship, kind of like the traditional zombies from the Caribbean and things of that nature.
Mm. So, what is it about zombies that appeals to you as a writer?
You know, I the thing with zombies, what I find fascinating about them, it's it's a very dark type of life after death. These are creatures that cannot be negotiated with. There's no there's no trying to talk them out of doing what they do. Um, what I find interesting about them is that they just kind of they move with a sense of purpose that is completely unknown to us. And there's no way for us as humans to know exactly what that purpose is. So when we talk about the zombies that consume others, that's always been fascinating. The idea that of all the things that they lost, the one thing they did not lose is their appetite. In other veins of the zombie lore, the fact that a person can be kind of turned into a living zombie, either through means of black magic, through voodoo or hoodoo, to serve someone else. And the idea that if you are turned into one of these things, you're kind of like you have to serve a master. So I find it interesting how I'm not sure how we went from that particular type of lore into making them flesh eaters, but that's one of those are the two concepts I find very fascinating about them.
Okay, so what do you think the appeal for zombies is for readers? I mean, what is it about the genre and the undead in general that resonates with horror fans, do you think?
You know. That's a good question. When I think about why what drew me to them, um, it's the I think partly what I said before about the idea of life after death, the conception that the the soul might leave the body, but the body still continues to live in some kind of arcane way. I think for readers, the zombie on the page gives them an opportunity. I think it's a safe space. Actually, I think when you're watching them, it's a much more visceral type of reaction when you look at it on the screen. When you read it in the pages of a book, the concept of the way they move, the idea that they can there is no there I'm trying to really put it together here, because the idea on the page, like when I've written it on the page, I don't really get into the head of the zombie. I get into the head of the victims, or the people who have to survive it, which I think is what made The Walking Dead so popular. It wasn't just the monsters, it's the idea of what happens to the world around the monsters, and how people try to adapt to a world where you are literally on the menu, no matter where you go. And I think that's one of the big appeals for readers.
Okay, so do you think the idea of zombies lends itself to creating metaphor and parallels to society, becoming essentially a reflection of certain aspects of humanity?
Oh, definitely. I think, and I know Romero did a lot of this with his work, where it was social commentary. I think that when we look at particularly zombie holocausts, zombie apocalypse, things of those natures, it is a reflection of how we as humans take for granted what we have. I think in one respects we don't respect. There's this aspect of not respecting life. This idea that people are just, I'm going to live my life however I want, and I don't really care about the guy next door, until that becomes an actual threat, um, for society and globally. When we look at it, what happens to the world? What are the things that we're doing to the world itself that will raise something like this? Oftentimes, in stories about zombies coming back to life, there has been some kind of chemical warfare, or there has been some kind of um, accident that has happened with radiation or some form of poisoning, that has caused the dead to come back. And they are the allegory of what happens in the second life. What happens after this world has been decimated? The dead now take control, but now they're just meandering around. I know particularly when we talk about Romero's, everybody's probably everybody's favorite was Dawn of the Dead, and how they talk about how the zombies go back to the mall. Well, it was part of the life that they knew. There was a place that they knew to gather. So instinct takes over, and they just kind of move in that direction. So and even with my piece about the slave ship, um it is an allegory of being, it's they weren't just slaves to be shipped from one place to the other. They traded their lives themselves into being slaves to continue to carry on in some form or fashion. So the world that they even exist in, which is filled with, violence and hate, the only way to combat that would be to die and to come back, so that you cannot die on the back end, you can exactly exact your revenge.
Interesting. So you touched a little on this already. Is the early idea of zombies was infused with rituals and supernatural forces. Now it kind of incorporates the idea of disease and epidemic as well. So, what are your thoughts on this evolution? And do you prefer the more traditional rise from the dead shuffling zombies or the more modern semi-science based plague zombies?
Um, you know, I don't know which ones I like more. I think I like the evolution of them. I think any monster should have a point of evolution for itself. I don't think any monster, I mean, practically we keep the monster, the zombie is still the zombie. It's still sort of there's no soul there. It kind of caters to what either a master that's controlling it, or they are slaves themselves to their own instincts. I think that core concept uh, in creating them is strong and doesn't really necessarily need to be changed. But as they evolved over time, because at one point they didn't eat people. There was like we talked about the ritualistic. The rituals were scary in themselves, and I think a lot of those stories were sort of. I guess it was a twofold process with that because we're looking at many of those stories came out of the Caribbean. It came out of West Africa. The idea of using powders and medicine and things of that nature to turn somebody into a zombie to control. Uh, that in and of itself is a frightening premise because I guess during the times these stories are told, these were there was no clear answer as to why this was happening. When we get to the ones now where they're either coming back from disease or some other part or some other form of chemical reaction, I love the science behind that because what that does, it takes away from this traditional idea that we have. And what makes it now scary is because it now reflects the time we live in. So when you look at the classic stories, uh, and the times in which those were made and those stories were told, they fit that dynamic perfectly. People exploring, going to other cultures, not understanding how things work. Once we roll into something that we all can relate to, we had a pandemic, which in a lot of those stories, that's how this starts. People get sick, somebody dies, they reanimate, and oh no, we have a problem on our hands. Um, I think I like the science-based stuff because it actually makes us think and take a look at our own humanity and look at it kind of tells you there are other forces out there beyond our control. And if something like this were to happen, exactly how ready would we be for something like that? So I like the science-based ones a little, I guess a little bit more than the traditional.
Yeah, it's kind of an evolution of what we're fearing as well, because one time, we were fearing magic and supernatural forces and things beyond what we knew. And now we're more fearing science and technology and the
Hmm.
things that might happen from it. Yeah.
Right, right.
Interesting.
Mhm.
So when you're describing a zombie in your writing, what do you focus on? The physical aspect, sounds, smells, or do you balance it all into a perfect visual?
Uh, I guess for me, I start off with the physical, what they look like. Uh, for me, zombies, when I've created zombies, they're not decomposing corpses. When I think of reanimation of bodies, I don't think of something that has been dead for like over 100 years, and suddenly it comes back and it's on a rampage. I usually try to stay within what happened to the person before, moments before they reanimate. Then it's getting inside the head of the creature itself. Because the flesh eaters, particularly, are running off of instinct more or rather than thought process, those tend to be, for me, a little bit simpler to craft because I know exactly what their intent is. When I go back to craft a story where the zombies are not being reanimated in the way where the only thing that's going to happen with them is that they're going to be going by instinct, they're going to be controlled, then I'd go inside of their brains to figure out how much of their mindset is going to be allowed to be controlled and how much of it is going to be free will. And that's always a wonderful dynamic to play with because you got the zombie that's actually fighting mentally not to be controlled by the person that brought them back, or accepting their fate and saying, you know what, I would rather be a slave to this life and be able to have the freedoms I want to have rather than live the life of a mortal being. So those are the two factors that I go into. And then it's going into the world itself, how they're going to interact with the world that they live in, because that plays a huge part whether or not the humans in this particular world are going to be accepting of these. Are they hunters? Are they going to be hunting these monsters down and trying to kill them? Or is there something else there? Maybe there's a third party there. Maybe there might be something cosmic behind everything else, and the zombie and the humans are just pretty much pieces on a chessboard. So those are the kind of three dynamics I work with when I'm crafting a zombie story.
Okay, so what do you think are the most overused aspects of the zombie genre?
Oh, overused. Um, you know, I I think when we got out of the when once we got into the running zombie, I think that one got a little overused too quickly. I understood it for what it was worth, but it kind of for me it kind of took away from the genre a little bit because now, I mean, they don't get tired. I mean, you're chasing a human being. There's only so much of that you can work with within the story. I guess some people would say the idea, the modern zombie of them eating people, gets overused too much, and it can be in a way. I think that um, if that's the only focus point about the creature itself and we're not going to go into any other aspects of it, I think that could be considered something that's overused.
Okay, so you mentioned George Romero's films. So why he certainly popularized the genre. But why do you think they became such cult classics? What is it about those particular movies?
Oh, um, that's a question. I'm thinking back to why I even started watching those films. I know that growing up, I was a huge horror buff. I loved, I grew up with Michael and Freddie and Jason, and for me, the zombie film was almost sort of like a taboo type of film. It was because that's not something you were used to seeing all the time. If you wanted to see people in the slasher flick die in and so forth. That was one thing, but you wanted to go hardcore horror, like gory, you turned to the Romero films. You went to the Living Dead films because you were getting something completely different. You didn't. I think the very first time I saw Night of the Living Dead, I thought, this isn't too bad, till they started eating people. Then that completely changed the way I looked at horror. And then I literally went back to back to back, not because uh, I was so enamored by it. Part of me was like, I got to get these out of the way, because if it's this bad in black and white, I can only imagine what it's going to look like in color. And I think, with the very first time I watched them, I was fascinated with the gore because I'd never seen anything like that. I had never. It was almost like I shouldn't be watching this, but I couldn't get my eyes off of it. It was something completely different. When I started writing, I went back and looked at them for the structure of the story and what Romero was trying to say about society and why these creatures existed. But I think for a lot of people, the Romero films are sort of like a rite of passage. If you're going to be a fan of horror, you have to go and look at these films. You have to watch them. You have to absorb them. And I think they also have a very grindhouse feel to them. They were films that I remember Dawn and Day of the Dead when I was growing up, from the radio advertisements for them. Not I never saw a trailer, but even hearing them on the radio was frightening. And but it was always they were the NC-17 movies of our time. You couldn't get in, you couldn't see these things without an adult. So I think that's one of the big things about those films that everybody completely cherishes, because it's kind of a rite of passage for a lot of
Hmm.
horror heads.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Mhm.
So, do you think zombies work better in books or movies, or do they both contribute something unique to the genre?
I think it's a unique setting for both, because I will also add graphic novels to it, because The Walking Dead uh, really changed the way a lot of us were looking at horror comics. Before then, we didn't have comics like that. We didn't have graphic novels like that. So I think it each medium feeds a different desire for that subject matter. I think seeing it, like I said earlier, seeing it brings about a more visceral um, response. Reading them on the page, not graphic novel or comic book vibe, but when you read it, you're allowed to create the scenario in your head based on what you're reading. And I think they can become a lot more terrifying in your own mind than just seeing them. I think seeing them gives you one type of feel, reading them, and then you kind of get the best of both worlds when you're reading a graphic novel or comic, and you're being able to read and see it at the same time. So your brain is really getting the best of both worlds in that situation. But each medium the zombie shows up in, I think, gives us something very special. I don't think one is better than the other. I put it that way.
Okay, so what are some of your favorite zombie themed books or graphic novels?
To be honest, I I haven't read a lot of zombie. I know I started out with The Walking Dead in the '90s when a friend of mine put me onto it. There have been. I'm a huge fan of Reanimator. Um, despite the
Yeah.
The yeah
Yeah.
the
Despite, let's
yeah,
yeah,
yeah, let's say despite Lovecraft's
yeah.
unique way of putting things into a story, um I became a fan of the film first, and then I had to hunt the book down because it was there, it was hard to find for years. But that story uh always was terrifying for me as well. um so and then there's I know that there was one other book, I believe it's called The Living Dead, which was a Romero book that I had read not too long ago. Was was a lot of fun to read. Uh so for literature wise, I haven't really delved deep into a lot of literary zombies, which more or less has, I wouldn't say has been a bad thing for me. I think that when I started tackling writing zombies, I knew I didn't want to go in the traditional sense. So I kind of had enough information from the small bouts of written work that I read to help me go in a different direction. Uh, and I will also add Tales from the Crypt. I had bought a couple of those reprint comics when I was in high school. Uh, I love those. There were a lot of like small zombie stories in there, and I'm trying to think. There's one more. There was a zombie story that it wasn't Tales from the Crypt. Oh, Creep Show. When they released the comic, I was still preteen when those came out. So that first zombie story, how Father's Day, was always a very fun story for me.
Okay, so what are your favorite zombie-themed movies?
Ooh, okay. Um, the original Dawn of the Dead um, tops my list. White Zombie with Bela Lugosi uh, became a kind of an acquired taste. I Walked with the Zombie was another. Reanimator is another one of my favorite ones, and um, I would say I guess almost all of Romero's work. Dead Snow was another one about Nazi zombies. That was an interesting one. And if I want to go across into Europe, I was a big fan of 28 Days Later, 28 Days, and then um oh, why am I now forgetting Peter Jackson's very ultra gory Dead Alive was another one that I really enjoyed.
Okay, so if you were writing a monster mashup, which creature would you pit against a zombie? Would you go like a classic vampire werewolf, or would you choose another monster?
I am a huge werewolf fan. I love werewolves. So I would probably put a werewolf up against a zombie. I think that would be a very interesting dynamic to see, since once you become a werewolf, you kind of like you don't really remember who you are, where you are. The animal side takes over, and I think that would actually be a really great dynamic because you have two monsters that have no clue as to what they are and completely working off instinct. You know, one the instinct to kill, the other one the instinct to feed. And I think that would be it would be interesting to see a werewolf go up against um, a zombie and see how that dynamic would work.
Yeah, it might be interesting to see what happens if they both survive the fight too, because a werewolf will turn someone into a werewolf, and a zombie, some zombies can turn people
And
into.
people,
So you might end up with a hybrid almost.
yeah, I mean, one bite. that- You know, you got that's a good question. Like, if they bite each other, then what? You
Yeah,
know, now you got a zombie werewolf, and then you got a werewolf zombie. So it's like that would be very comical in if done in a certain light. I
yeah.
think. Mhm.
So when you're not writing about zombies and other monsters, what do you do to relax and unwind? Do you have any hobbies?
Uh, Let me see. I Funny enough, I do play video games. Yes, I do play horror games, but if I don't feel like dealing, if I want to get away from that aspect, mostly video games. Sometimes I'll read. Even as an author, I get an opportunity. You don't really get a too many opportunities just to sit and read other people's work sometimes because I'm constantly working on something. So oftentimes it's nice to get somebody recommend something to me and say, "Hey, did you read this? You should take some time out to read it." And I do work with the Center for Fiction here in Brooklyn, so I moderate a workshop where we read horror novels and then we get together to critique them. So I get an opportunity to pick books that I've not read. Um, Either I haven't read in years and have always wanted to go back and read, or I pick something I've always wanted to read, and that becomes a great piece for discussion. But for the most part, yeah, that's what I like to do to kind of unwind.
Okay, so what's coming up next for you? Do you have any book secrets you wanna share with everybody?
I have a vampire novel coming out in November called Sinister Ascension. So that's my big project right now that I've kind of been locked in the house finishing up, getting ready to send the the next draft to my publisher so that that can get done. So that's next on the list. I have submitted shorter fiction uh, to other anthologies. I'm just waiting to hear callbacks on those to see whether or not they made the cut or not.
Oh, sounds like fun. I think we'll wrap the episode up here. I'd like to thank you for being a guest.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Shadows and Ink. Bye for now.
Bye bye.